Everyone, welcome back for section 2 of chapter 4. We are again looking at demand. So in this lecture, I'll talk a little bit about the factors that can create changes in demand and can therefore shift a demand curve. I'll give you an example of how change in demand for one good can affect change in demand for another good, and various odds and ends. So those will be our big topics today. Let's get started. All right. So few different vocab words that you are going to need to know. Ceteris paribus is just a Latin phrase that means all things held constant. So if nothing changes, this will be the case. Okay. Won't need to really know much about that, but I'll use that term when I'm talking about some other stuff throughout the lecture. So just something good to know. You will see for sure on your quiz like questions about normal goods versus inferior goods. So a normal good would be a good that consumers demand more of when their income increases. So they may demand more of sushi, right? Because sushi is not the cheapest food on the planet. So if they have a little bit more income, they may get sushi more often for supper. An inferior good is the opposite. This is a good that consumers demand less of when their income increases. So an example of an inferior good might be like a box of ramen noodles, right? Not the most luxurious food out there. And so people may eat it more often when they're in a bind. And so if their income increases, they may say, hey, I get to eat a hamburger instead of ramen noodles, right? So that would be an inferior good. We'll talk a little bit about demographics and the role that they play in demand. Those are just the statistical characteristics of a population, and really they're used to identify consumer markets. We'll talk about complements, which are two goods that are bought and used together, so hot dogs and hot dog buns. And we'll also talk about substitutes, so goods that are used in place of one another. So why does the demand curve shift? Okay, if we think about the demand curve from last section, we talked about how a change in price can affect the demand curve. But if you only have a change in price, your dot on your demand curve is just going to move along the demand curve. Today we're talking about shifts in demand. So other changing market conditions that actually cause your entire curve to shift to the right or the left. So shifts in demand are caused by more than just price increases and decreases. It's other factors in the market. So I have kind of a acronym for you to use to remember what causes shifts in the demand curve, and that is timer. So first, we have changes in taste. Okay, consumer taste and advertising. So if something becomes a little bit more trendy, that's a change in consumer taste, right? And so if something becomes trendy, we may see a shift in demand where at every price level, that good is more popular, okay? Advertising can kind of inspire trends, right? Because, oh, that looks cool on TV. So that has an effect on consumer taste, which is why it's lumped in with taste. Changes in income. If everyone is like bringing home more money, that can have an effect. We'll talk a little bit more about that. changes in the market. So changes in your population or changes in your demographics. Say when college starts back up again, there's this shift in demand because you have more college kids in town. So your bars and restaurants may be more busy. You may sell more ramen noodles. You may sell more mini fridges, right? Like those sorts of things. So changes in the population or the demographics of a population can lead to changes in the market, which will affect demand. Then we have consumer expectations. So do we think that the price in the future is going to go up or down? That can affect current demand. And then we'll also talk about related goods and how they can affect demand curves. Okay, so a demand schedule, like we talked about in 4.1, only takes into account changes in price. It does not consider the effects of news reports or any one of the thousands of other factors that could change from day to day that could affect demand for a particular good. So if there was a safety recall on Sargento cheese, obviously that's going to affect demand. People are not going to want to buy Sargento while there's an outstanding safety alert, right? So then that would lead to a shift in demand because at every price point, people are buying less. A demand curve is only accurate as long as there are no changes other than price that could affect a consumer's decision. In other words, the demand curve is accurate only as long as ceteris paribus is true, right? That's that Latin term that means all other things are held constant. When that rule is not true anymore, other factors can change demand, and we no longer see just a movement along the demand curve, we see a shift of the entire curve. That means at every price, consumers buy a different quantity than they would have before. So a shift in the entire demand curve is what economists refer to as a change in demand. So, what's the assumption mean? When we are no longer just moving along the demand curve, but shifting it to the right or to the left, as I mentioned, that means at every price point, consumers buy a different quantity than they had before. So, a decrease in demand is always going to be shown as a leftward shift in the demand curve. An increase in demand is always going to be shown as a rightward shift in the demand curve. So with a decrease at every price point, people are buying less than they had before. An increase at every price point, people are buying more than they had before. So what impacts that? I gave you that timer acronym, but I want to go over a few of these more in depth. So first we have income. That was the I in timer. So most items that we purchase are normal goods, which means we're going to demand more of them when our income increases. Okay, a rise in income would cause the demand curve to shift to the right. Imagine you get like a 25% raise. You're going to buy more of everything, right? Because you got more money to spend. So that is going to increase demand. A fall in income would cause the demand curve to shift to the left, which indicates a decrease in demand. So right now, with the pandemic and the economy struggling, people in general have less income. So we're seeing a leftward shift in many demand curves, at least demand curves for normal goods. So a normal good, I gave you the example of sushi. People may be eating out less, maybe ordering food less because they have less money. available to spend, maybe because they're out of work or their hours have been reduced or whatever it may be, which is going to cause a leftward shift in demand. If we're talking about inferior goods, having less income actually has the opposite effect. So if I have less income, I might start eating more ramen noodles, and so the demand curve for ramen noodles may actually shift to the right. So with income, it matters if it's a normal good or an inferior good. Okay, but with most goods, they're going to be normal goods, which means that we buy more when we have more money. So how will an anticipated rise in price affect consumer demand? So another part of your timer acronym was E, expectations. Okay, the current demand for a good is positively related to its future price. So if you expect the price to rise in the future, the current demand will rise because people want to buy it now before the price goes up. If you expect the price to drop in the future, current demand is going to decrease because you're going to wait for the lower price. So why buy a TV in October when you know that they're all going to be on sale on Black Friday? Right? So what you expect the price to do in the future has an impact on current demand. All right, so the next part of that timer acronym was the market. And in that market area, I talked about changes to the population or the demographics of the population. So when it comes to population, changes in the size of a population will also affect demand for most products, right? If you have more people living in an area than you ever did before, you're going to have higher demand across the board. Population trends have a particularly strong effect on certain goods. For example, like needs, basically. So any sort of food or housing, right? As the population increases, we see like more apartment buildings pop up and stuff because we know people are going to have demand for a place to live, food to eat, so on and so forth. And then demographics was the second piece of that. So demographics are the characteristics of a population, such as age, gender, race, occupation. And so businesses use demographic information to classify potential customers. And demographics are going to have a strong influence on packaging and pricing and advertising, right? If they are trying to advertise to college students, they're going to probably have lower prices, trendy packaging, so on and so forth. An example from a few years back is Diet Coke looked at their sales information and their demand information and found out that, hey, most of the people that are drinking Diet Coke are in their 40s to 50s, like in that range. And we're just not appealing to 20 to 30-year-olds like we want to be. So what Diet Coke did is they redid their cans to be like the slim cans with these more trendy labels, right? And this was like Diet Coke's attempt at getting millennials to start drinking Diet Coke, right? So instead of drinking your sparkling water or whatever it may be, Diet Coke was thinking if they rebranded, they could appeal to a younger population than they previously had. So demographic information has an effect on advertising, packaging, so on and so forth. So advertising is a factor that shifts the demand curve because it plays an important role in trend setting, which was that first part of the timer taste was consumer taste and preferences, and that's all influenced by advertising. So think if a company buys a Super Bowl slot, they are advertising to millions and millions of Americans, right? And they know that if they can have a good advertisement at the Super Bowl, they can increase demand for their product. Because their product will become trendy, people will want it. So that's why companies spend enormous amounts of money on advertising, because they hope that it will increase the demand for the goods that they sell. And then the last part of timer was related goods. So there's two types of related goods, complements and substitutes. They interact in different ways. So a complement is two goods that are bought and used together. So I gave the example of hot dogs and hot dog buns. Or in this case, maybe it is like this snowboard and the boots that go with it, right? Those would be complements because they are bought and used together. So if there's an increase in demand for snowboards, then we will also see an increase in demand for boots because you can't use one without the other. Okay? So the demand curve for one item can also shift in response to demand for another item. Substitutes have the opposite effect. So substitutes are goods that are used in place of one another. So maybe hot dogs and hamburgers. You're deciding what to have for dinner, and the hot dog is $1 and the hamburger is $2. Okay? So because the hamburger is more expensive, people may choose hot dog as the option, as the substitute. And so demand for hot dogs is going to increase at the same time that demand for hamburgers is going to decrease. So that is section 2. Lots of things that are definitely going to show up mostly as multiple choice questions on your next quiz. So please make sure to let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.